On a frigid January morning in 1649, an unprecedented event unfolded that would alter the course of English history forever. But King Charles I approached his death not amidst the clamor of a distant battlefield or the foreign lands of conquest, but in front of his own subjects, in the very heart of his capital city, London. The English Civil War had ravaged not only armies, but it also dismantled the very structures of power, belief in divine right, and concepts of justice held dear by society. The ramifications of this conflict were horrific. It spurred executions marked by such calculated brutality that their echoes of terror would resonate throughout England for generations to come. The English Civil War was far more than a mere struggle between the monarchy and Parliament. It evolved into a horrific theater where political adversaries were not simply defeated, but obliterated in the most public and fearsome manners. These executions were meticulously designed not just to dispense death, but to deliver chilling messages aimed at shattering the spirits of the populace and showcasing the overwhelming might of those wielding the executioner's axe. Today, we explore this dark chapter in English history, where the notions of justice, twisted into instruments of vengeance and death, became a morbid spectacle. From the shocking beheading of King Charles I to the posthumous desecration of Oliver Cromwell's body, the narrative of this tumultuous period recounts some of the most horrifying methods of judicial murder ever documented. These were not the swift deaths characteristic of modern warfare. Rather, they were protracted and agonizing spectacles designed to maximize both physical suffering and psychological terror. The individuals who faced such fates were not mere statistics. They were complex human beings, kings, commoners, generals, spies, priests, and politicians experiencing their final moments in ways that elude comprehension. Their harrowing stories illuminate how swiftly civilization can unravel when political norms collapse, leaving behind only the primal pursuit of power and the dark ingenuity of human cruelty. What amplifies the horror of these executions is their premeditated nature. They were not spontaneous acts of violence fueled by passion or the chaos of war. Rather, they were coldly orchestrated, legally sanctioned executions carried out with chilling precision and ceremony. The executioners were not shadowy figures hidden in the night, but public officials sanctioned by the state. And the crowds that gathered were not bloodthirsty mobs, but ordinary citizens, drawn to witness what their leaders deemed as justice. The psychological impact of such brutal punishments rippled throughout society, instilling a pervasive culture of fear where a single misplaced word or perceived suspicion could lead to unimaginable suffering and death. This was state-sponsored terror in its most raw form, but the brutality of the punishment served dual roles of revenge and a warning to any who might challenge the newly established order. As we reflect on these dark events, we must grapple with the chilling realization that they unfolded within a society that prided itself on being civilized and Christian. The individuals responsible for such horrors, learned scholars, devout believers, respected leaders, were convinced they were serving both God and their country. Their actions remind us just how easily moral boundaries can be trampled underfoot when the stakes of political survival are high. The legacy of these executions would shape English society for centuries to follow, demonstrating that no one, not even a king, vested with divine right, was immune to the specter of political violence. They illustrated the rapid distortion of legal frameworks to fulfill vengeful desires and showcased how public spectacles could be weaponized to subjugate entire populations through fear. Most disturbingly, they laid bare the depths of cruelty that human beings can inflict upon one another when they convince themselves their cause justifies any means. The roots of the English Civil War, which erupted in 1642, were not born of sudden fury, but were the culmination of escalating tensions that had simmered for decades between King Charles I and Parliament. For 11 years, Charles had ruled without summoning Parliament. Finance for his government derived from increasingly unpopular taxes and forced loans many deemed illegal. His marriage to Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic, raised suspicions among his Protestant subjects. Fearing a resurgence of Catholicism, tensions mounted further with his appointment of Archbishop William Laud, whose rigorous persecution of Puritan ministers incited outrage. The immediate spark igniting the conflict came when Charles attempted to impose a new prayer book on Scotland, leading to the bishops' wars and compelling him to reconvene Parliament to secure funds. Instead of compliance, Parliament presented Charles with a list of grievances that would severely curtail royal power. In January 1642, the king made the fateful decision to arrest 5 members of Parliament, an act that constituted a profound violation of parliamentary privilege and cemented widespread distrust in his willingness to adhere to constitutional limitations on his authority. By August of that year, both factions were raising armies, though neither anticipated that the war would proliferate into a lengthy and brutal conflict. Initial encounters in the war adhered to traditional rules of engagement, with prisoners treated according to established military customs and executions confined to clear cases of treason. However, as the war lingered and casualties escalated, both sides resorted to increasingly ruthless tactics against captured foes. The conflict's religious dimensions intensified the violence. Many parliamentarians viewed themselves as engaged in a holy struggle against Catholic tyranny, while royalists considered their adversaries as insurrectionists rebelling against divine authority. A climate of religious fervor made compromise nearly impossible and lent justification for increasingly extreme measures against those seen not merely as political adversaries, but as threats to salvation itself. The disintegration of central authority during the war fostered a legal vacuum that both sides exploited to eliminate their foes. Courts-martial operated with scant oversight, and traditional legal protections were repeatedly suspended in the name of military necessity. This erosion of legal safeguards facilitated the summary executions and torture that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. Moreover, the war catalyzed previously sidelined groups to pursue personal vendettas. Puritan ministers, once persecuted, seized opportunities for retribution, while ambitious military leaders sought to advance their careers through displays of ruthless efficiency. Personal grudges often fueled the most violent depredations, as individuals leveraged the chaos of war for private grievances. The accompanying propaganda war further heightened violence by dehumanizing opponents. Royalist pamphlets depicted parliamentarians as godless traitors seeking to dismantle church and monarchy, while parliamentary publications characterized royalists as conspirators intent on enslaving Protestant England. Through this relentless torrent of hostile propaganda, both sides rationalized increasingly brutal treatment of their adversaries. Perhaps most critically, the war established a precedent for political violence that would prove remarkably difficult to contain. Once it became socially acceptable to oppose established authority through armed conflict, and once the first politically motivated executions occurred, the bounds of acceptable behavior expanded with alarming speed. Each atrocity seemed to justify escalations of violence and retaliation, perpetuating a cycle of revenge that culminated in some of the most horrific executions recorded in English history. The execution of King Charles I on January 30th, 1649, remains one of the most psychologically jarring episodes in that history. No European monarch had ever been subjected to public trial and execution by the very subjects from whom he claimed to rule. This act fundamentally challenged the prevailing notions of political authority that had governed European society for centuries. The principle of the divine right of kings, the belief that monarchs were appointed by God and were answerable solely to him, died with Charles Stuart on that fateful winter morning. The trial itself was a meticulously orchestrated event replete with political theater, though many who participated privately questioned its legitimacy. Of the 135 commissioners assigned to prosecute the king, only 68 attended the trial, and even fewer signed the death warrant. John Bradshaw, president of the court, donned a specially made bulletproof hat and employed armed guards out of fear for his life. The king, for his part, refused to acknowledge the court's authority, steadfastly asserting that no earthly power held the right to judge an anointed monarch. As Charles faced his trial in Westminster Hall, he was charged with treason, murder, and being a public enemy of the nation. The prosecution, led by John Cook, posited that the king had waged war against his own people, thereby committing crimes against the state. His refusal to enter a plea was interpreted as a tacit admission of guilt. Even as legal scholars at the time recognized this as a violation of fundamental tenets of English law. The decision to execute Charles was not made lightly or without dissent. Many parliamentary leaders, including Oliver Cromwell, initially hoped for a negotiated settlement that could maintain the monarchy while curtailing the king's powers. However, Charles' continued dealings with foreign entities and his obvious determination to reclaim absolute authority ultimately convinced radical factions within Parliament that he could never be trusted. The unearthing of clandestine correspondence revealed that he regarded any potential agreement as merely a temporary arrangement to be discarded at his earliest opportunity. The scaffold was erected before the banqueting house at Whitehall, the very location where Charles had once entertained foreign ambassadors during lavish court ceremonies. The poignancy of this irony was deliberate. The man who had proclaimed a divine right as the basis for his rule was to be executed in the shadow of his own palace, subjected to the gaze of his subjects. Special galleries were constructed for spectators, while troops encircled the execution site to thwart any rescue attempts or demonstrations of support for the doomed monarch. On the morning of his execution, Charles donned 2 shirts to minimize shivers from the cold that might be misinterpreted as signs of fear. He ascended the scaffold with remarkable composure, maintaining the dignity that had characterized his reign even amidst dark times. In his final speech, he insisted upon his innocence regarding the charges, reaffirming his belief in the monarchy as a divinely ordained institution. The execution was executed swiftly, with the executioner whose identity remains unknown, delivering a single stroke of the axe to sever the king's head from his body. In keeping with tradition, he held aloft the severed head, declaring, "Behold the head of a traitor." Yet rather than cheers or jubilation from the crowd, eerie silence enveloped the scene, punctuated only by gasps and sobs from spectators who suddenly grasped the profound ramifications of the moment. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, the deep rifts within English society became glaringly apparent. While some parliamentary supporters rejoiced at the end of tyranny, countless ordinary citizens recoiled in horror, perceiving the king's death as an act of regicide and sacrilege. Royalist pamphlets promptly circulated narratives of miraculous signs tied to the king's passing, while his supporters collected relics stained with his blood. The intended objective of this execution was to extinguish any lingering loyalty to the monarchy, yet it instead birthed a martyrdom for Charles I, inspiring resistance for years to follow. With the death of Charles I, a wave of retributive violence surged forth, defining the Commonwealth period under Oliver Cromwell and the Rump Parliament. The new regime faced the daunting task of managing thousands of royalist supporters, men viewed not merely as vanquished enemies, but as traitors who had risen against the legitimate government. Given that the punishment for treason was death, the newly established authorities exhibited little mercy in meting out this ultimate penalty. The most systematic campaign of executions erupted in Ireland, where Cromwell spearheaded a ruthless reconquest justified as retribution for the 1641 rebellion that had seen the deaths of thousands of Protestant settlers. The sieges of Drogheda and Wexford in 1649 resulted in massacres that stunned even those accustomed to the Civil War-esque violence. When Drogheda capitulated, Cromwell ordered the execution of the entire garrison alongside many Catholic priests and civilians seeking refuge. His correspondence chillingly detailed the slaughter, noting bloodshed continued long after organized resistance had ceased. In Wexford, the brutality reached horrifying heights. Following the town's surrender, parliamentary forces initiated a massacre that accounted for over 2,000 lives, including women and children who sought sanctuary in churches. Cromwell justified these atrocities as divine judgment against a rebellious populace, asserting that such extremes would paradoxically minimize future bloodshed by deterring further insurrection. The notion that extreme cruelty could, in the long run, serve a merciful purpose would recur as a theme in Commonwealth rationalizations for gruesome executions. In England, the pursuit of remaining royalist leaders continued with relentless vigor. Special courts were constituted to prosecute individuals accused of treason, and legal procedures hastily favored rapid convictions over the meticulous examination of evidence. Many defendants found themselves without legal counsel, confronting judges who had already predetermined their guilt. High-profile victims included the Duke of Hamilton, the Earl of Holland, and Lord Capel, all of whom met the executioner's block in 1649. Despite their noble lineage, which had traditionally afforded protection against the death penalty, the Commonwealth's approach to executions signaled a marked departure from established English precedents. Where previous regimes often exhibited leniency toward noble prisoners or commuted sentences. The new government was resolute in crafting public spectacles meant to deter future insurrection. These executions were meticulously orchestrated, featuring elaborate ceremonies and lengthy orations detailing the crimes of the condemned and the righteousness of their punishment. Such spectacles served multiple purposes. They showcased the power of the new regime, entertained the masses, and created martyrs whose deaths could galvanize lingering opposition. In this unsettling domain of brutality and vengeance, the English Civil War stands as a stark reminder of the fragility of civilization and the perils of unchecked power. It highlights how swiftly societal structures can dissolve in the face of political conflict, revealing the darkest aspects of human nature when the pursuit of authority leads to moral compromise. Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to support our work and never miss an upload. Like, comment, and share.